Papillon set, French Guiana, 1973. In the suffocating heat of a replica prison cell, two completely different approaches to acting were about to collide in the most violent way possible. One believed in emotional preparation. The other believed in raw, unfiltered reality. The Devil's Island prison set had been constructed with obsessive attention to detail on a remote stretch of coastline that closely resembled the infamous French penal colony. Every stone wall had been aged and weathered by hand. Every rusted iron bar carried the patina of decades. Every damp corner was designed to transport actors and audiences back to the most feared prison in the world, where the worst criminals of the 19th century had been sent to die under the merciless tropical sun. The heat was unbearable, 110 degrees in what little shade existed, with humidity so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. The crew moved like zombies through the oppressive atmosphere, their energy sapped by the tropical climate that director Franklin Schaffner had insisted upon for complete authenticity. This wasn't a comfortable Hollywood soundstage with air conditioning and craft services. This was as close to the real Devil's Island experience as modern filmmaking could achieve without actually imprisoning the cast and crew. Production had been plagued with problems from the beginning: equipment failures due to moisture, crew members collapsing from heat exhaustion. But Schaffner was determined to create something unprecedented in prison cinema, a film that would make audiences feel the physical and psychological brutality of the world's most notorious penitentiary. Steve McQueen thrived in these conditions like a man returning to his natural habitat. At 43, he had spent years preparing for this role, not through method acting or emotional preparation, but by actually living rough. He had studied prison documentaries, visited real penitentiaries, and most importantly, drawn from his own extensive experiences with authority, confinement, and survival. McQueen's childhood had been a series of reform schools and juvenile detention centers. He understood the psychology of confinement, the unspoken rules that governed men living in cages, the subtle violence that simmered beneath every interaction. The prison set didn't intimidate him. It felt familiar, like a neighborhood he'd visited many times before. He moved through the oppressive heat with the easy confidence of a man who had faced worse conditions on the streets of Los Angeles and in the harsh institutions where society had tried to break his spirit. The physical demands of the role, the weight loss, the brutal living conditions, the psychological isolation, were just another day at the office for someone who had learned survival from necessity rather than theory. Dustin Hoffman, on the other hand, was struggling with every aspect of the production. At 36, Hoffman was riding high from The Graduate and Midnight Cowboy. He was also notoriously intense about his craft, believing deeply in method acting principles. To Hoffman, every role required genuine emotional connections through personal experience and psychological exploration. For weeks, Hoffman had been preparing for his role as Louis Dega with intense dedication. He carefully studied prisoner photos and read survivor memoirs. He experimented with confinement to understand captivity. But despite extensive preparation, Hoffman couldn't access the emotional reality required. If you respect the real Steve McQueen, subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy. The problem wasn't intellectual understanding. Hoffman could discuss the psychology of imprisonment with academic precision. The problem was that his method required him to connect personally to emotions and experiences that his comfortable, middle-class background had never provided. He had never been truly afraid for his life, never experienced genuine helplessness, never felt the kind of desperation that came from having absolutely no control over his circumstances. For this particular scene, a brutal interrogation sequence where his character would be tortured by prison guards while McQueen's Henri Charrière watched helplessly from the adjacent cell, Hoffman needed to portray genuine terror, physical pain, and psychological breakdown. According to his training, this meant he needed to access real memories of fear and helplessness, then channel those emotions into his performance. But Hoffman was discovering that some experiences couldn't be intellectually accessed. "I need to feel this," he kept saying to director Schaffner during the endless rehearsal sessions that were driving the crew to distraction. I need to understand what it actually feels like to be that afraid, that helpless, that completely at someone else's mercy. I can't just pretend to feel it. The audience will know it's not real. McQueen watched these preparations with growing irritation that he kept carefully hidden behind his trademark stoic expression. He had no patience for what he saw as intellectual masturbation disguised as professionalism. In McQueen's world, you didn't need to analyze fear. You either felt it or you didn't. You didn't need to research pain. Life provided plenty of opportunities to experience it firsthand if you weren't careful enough to avoid it. The philosophical divide between the two actors had been apparent from their first day on set. Hoffman approached every scene like a puzzle to be solved through careful analysis and emotional archaeology. McQueen approached every scene like a moment to be lived through instinct and authenticity. Dustin, McQueen said during one particularly long preparation session that had stretched into its third hour, "You're overthinking this whole thing. The character's afraid because he's about to be hurt. Just let it happen naturally." But Hoffman couldn't let anything happen naturally. His entire approach to acting was built on conscious, deliberate choices made through careful consideration of psychological motivations. He needed to understand his character's backstory, explore the deeper implications of every moment, find personal connections to the emotional content that would allow him to deliver what he considered authentic performance. "Steve, I respect your approach," Hoffman replied, his voice carrying the slight condescension of someone who believed his method was more sophisticated and professional. "But I need to find the truth of this moment. I need to really feel what Daga would feel in this situation, not just perform some surface version of fear." McQueen's pale blue eyes hardened almost imperceptibly, a change so subtle that only someone who knew him well would have recognized it as a warning sign. He had heard this kind of talk before from actors who believed that suffering could be intellectualized, that authenticity could be achieved through technique rather than experience, that genuine emotion was something you could summon through proper preparation rather than something that either existed or didn't. The tension had been building for days as production struggled with Hoffman's endless need for additional preparation time. His discussions with Schaffner about motivation and subtext, his requests for character research and psychological consultation, his insistence that every scene needed to be approached through careful emotional mapping before cameras could roll. McQueen, meanwhile, was ready to shoot every scene from the moment he arrived on set. He had read the script, understood his character's journey through the story, and was prepared to simply be Henri Charrière in front of the cameras. No extensive preparation needed. No psychological exploration required, just pure, instinctive performance born from real experience rather than academic theory. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had already climbed past 105 degrees. Schaffner called for the torture scene, the climactic moment where Daga would be beaten by guards while Charrière watched from his cell, powerless to intervene. It was crucial for establishing the bond between the two characters. Hoffman arrived having spent the previous evening preparing, meditating, reviewing character notes, trying to access memories that would help him portray genuine fear. "Franklin," Hoffman said as the crew set up, "I'm still not feeling the reality of this situation. I need to access genuine terror, but I can't connect to it intellectually." He turned to McQueen, who was sitting quietly in his cell, already in character. "Steve, maybe you could help me," Hoffman continued earnestly. "In this scene, I need to genuinely feel like I'm in danger. I need real fear, not performed fear. Could you help me find that emotional truth?" McQueen looked up from his script, those pale blue eyes studying Hoffman, with the calculating attention of a predator evaluating prey. Around the set, crew members who had worked with McQueen before began to sense danger in the air. "You want to feel real fear, Dustin?" His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but something in its tone made the nearby lighting technicians stop adjusting their equipment and pay attention to what was happening between the two stars. "Yes," Hoffman replied, apparently oblivious to the warning signals that everyone else on set was beginning to recognize. "I need to access genuine terror. I need to feel what it's really like to be helpless, to be completely at someone else's mercy. My preparation isn't getting me there intellectually." McQueen stood up slowly, his movement fluid and controlled like a big cat stretching before a hunt. He walked to the bars separating their cells, his hands gripping the iron with casual strength that made the metal creak softly. "You want method acting, Dustin? You want to feel real emotion instead of performed emotion?" Hoffman nodded eagerly, thinking he was about to receive some kind of philosophical insight about accessing authentic performance from one of Hollywood's most naturally gifted actors. "All right," McQueen said, his voice dropping to that whisper that anyone who knew him understood as a final warning. "Let's give you something real to work with." Schaffner called for action, the cameras began rolling with their familiar mechanical whir, and the scene started exactly as scripted. The actor playing the prison guard began his dialogue, moving toward Hoffman's character with the practiced menace that the script required. But then Steve McQueen did something that wasn't in the script. Without warning, McQueen reached through the bars with lightning speed and grabbed Hoffman by the throat. Not gently, not theatrically. With the sudden, shocking violence of a man who had learned to fight on the streets. Hoffman's eyes went wide, not with performed terror, but with genuine panic. His hands flew to McQueen's wrist, trying to pry those fingers away, but McQueen's grip was like iron. For 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes to everyone watching, Hoffman couldn't breathe. His face began to redden, then darken toward purple. His struggles became more desperate, more real, more authentically terrified than any performance he had ever given. The intellectual, analytical actor who had spent hours trying to access genuine fear was suddenly experiencing exactly what he had been seeking, but getting it in a way that no method acting class had ever prepared him for. The camera kept rolling. Schaffner, recognizing that something extraordinary and unrepeatable was happening in front of his lens, made the split-second decision to let the scene continue. The crew stood frozen between fascination and horror, unsure whether they were witnessing brilliant improvisation or actual assault. McQueen's face remained calm, almost serene, as he maintained his grip on Hoffman's throat. His pale blue eyes never left Hoffman's panicked ones, studying the transformation from performed emotion to genuine terror with the clinical interest of a scientist observing a successful experiment. When McQueen finally released him, Hoffman collapsed against the stone wall of his cell, gasping for air like a drowning man who had just reached the surface. His entire body shook with adrenaline and shock. The fear in his eyes wasn't performed, wasn't researched, wasn't accessed through careful preparation. It was completely, authentically, terrifyingly real. "Cut," Schaffner called, his voice barely above a whisper. The set fell completely silent, except for the sound of Hoffman's labored breathing and the distant hum of generators powering the lights that had captured every second of what had just occurred. McQueen stepped back from the bars with casual indifference, his expression returning to its usual calm neutrality. He looked down at Hoffman, who was still slumped against the wall, trying to recover both physically and psychologically from what had just happened to him. "Now you felt it, didn't you, Dustin?" McQueen's voice was conversational, almost gentle, but with an edge that could cut glass. "Real fear. Real helplessness. Real understanding of what it means to be completely at someone else's mercy." Hoffman looked up at him, his face still flushed, his breathing still unsteady, his entire worldview about acting suddenly thrown into question. For the first time since filming had begun, he had nothing to say about method acting or emotional preparation or the intellectual approach to accessing authentic performance. McQueen continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned life's hardest lessons through direct experience rather than academic study. "See, the thing about method acting, Dustin, is that it assumes you need to think your way into feeling something real. But real emotion, real fear, real pain, real anything that actually matters doesn't come from thinking. It comes from living. He gestured toward Hoffman with casual dismissal, like a teacher pointing out an obvious error to a slow student. You spent hours trying to intellectually access terror. I gave you 10 seconds of the real thing. Which one felt more authentic to you? Hoffman still couldn't speak, but his expression had undergone a complete transformation. The condescending certainty was gone, replaced by something that looked like respect, mixed with genuine wariness and a new understanding of the gap between theory and reality. Method acting is for people who've never experienced the things they're trying to portray, McQueen continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident. It's intellectual simulation of emotional reality, but some of us don't need to simulate anything because we've actually lived it. He walked back to his position in the cell, settling into his character with the ease of someone putting on a comfortable jacket that he'd worn 1,000 times before. Next time you want to feel something real, Dustin, don't ask me to help you find it through technique. Just pay attention when life gives you the real thing. And be grateful when it's over. The silence stretched for another 30 seconds before Schaffner finally found his voice and called for the crew to reset for another take. But everyone on set knew that what they had just witnessed couldn't be replicated, shouldn't be replicated, and would never be forgotten. McQueen had given Hoffman, and everyone watching, a lesson in the difference between performed authenticity and the genuine article. When they shot the scene again, Hoffman's performance was electric, with newfound understanding. The terror in his eyes carried the cellular memory of what real helplessness felt like. His reactions were immediate, visceral, completely authentic in a way that no amount of preparation could have achieved. He never again questioned Steve McQueen's approach to acting. The incident became Hollywood legend within hours, spreading through the industry with the speed and intensity of wildfire. Some called it assault. Others called it the most effective acting lesson ever given. But everyone agreed on one thing. Steve McQueen had proven once again that authenticity couldn't be taught, couldn't be researched, couldn't be intellectually accessed. It could only be experienced. In a business built on pretense and simulation, McQueen remained dangerously, uncompromisingly real. Subscribe to Steve McQueen Untold Legacy for stories they never told you.